One of the most popular comments on Twitter or Facebook or in stories and blog posts about a Marist Poll survey goes something like this. You poll way too many Republican, Democrat, Independent. And that's why I don't believe your polls. Sometimes that's even followed with a hashtag fake polls. So do we really do that? Well, no. And we'll explain the science behind hashtag real polls. Also, pretty much every leader of America's national security establishment say that Russia not only will, but already is interfering in the 2018 elections. So do regular Americans believe that too? We're going to look at those numbers and also ask the single most important question of our era. Do aliens exist? There's a surprising change from the last time we asked that question in 2005. So let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm J.D. Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Margoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll. And we are here in Poughkeepsie, New York at the Hancock Center on the Marist College campus.
This is kind of polling 101 we're going to tackle today because it is the question that one of the questions that comes up most often. You deal with this in your classes like in the first couple of weeks, right, Lee?
Yeah, there's no doubt that what people do when they look at a poll result is the first thing the poll watchers do is they go and see, well, how many Democrats did they interview, how many Republicans, and then they say, well, there's a bias, it's prejudice, you have too many of one, not enough of the other, as you indicated. And it suggests it's usually followed up with a comment like, you modeled your electorate wrongly. You're looking at the wrong electorate. And although we're going to talk a little bit more detail and specifics, the short answer to that is we don't model to any particular electorate. We catch what comes through by doing the surveys because party ID is not a fixed number. It itself varies over time. So that's what we're looking at, and that's why the hammering that takes place in social media is often misguided.
Well, I think it's interesting because this has been something that has just gone on and on and on and on and rears its head again every election cycle. In fact, I love Harry Enton, formerly of 538, now of CNN. He actually has, as part of his Twitter biog, party identification is not party registration. In other words, we all, register to vote. Many of us register within a particular party. And that's not what we ask in these polls. We actually ask whether you consider yourself or you identify with a particular party. And that goes up and down. There's no magic number for the nation as a whole.
Because people don't register by party everywhere. So there is no place. You can't go to the library and look up how many Democrats there are, how many Republicans there are.
But party ID is also a subjective feeling of how you feel about the parties and also which one you lean more towards at any particular time. And we see that does vary. It can vary from poll to poll and month to month, depending upon the debate and the policy issues that are top of mind.
But if you're doing a national poll this week, before you even sit down to do it, what kind of numbers are you going to expect typically? Are there more Democrats than Republicans, more Republicans than Democrats? What is typically the result here in most polls that are done scientifically?
Well, typically means in 2018 because you actually can't go from year to year and say typically.
You can't even really go like month to month or quarter to quarter, really. It's a pretty volatile electorate, especially in the last couple of decades. It's been a fairly volatile electorate, hasn't it?
Well, because what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 decades is this decline in identification with either party. So people are moving more to the middle, identifying themselves as independent. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have some feeling towards one of the parties, leaning one way or another. There's only really a handful of people who say that they are independent.
Pure independence.
Pure independence.
So that might be 10% in the survey.
Right, and that really hasn't changed over time. There's that key 8 to 12% that say they're independent and they don't lean one way.
It depends
or
if you want to turn back the clock several decades. You'll find that the number of independents overall has grown at the expense of people identify
Yeah,
with the
because
political
one
party.
thing that is really cool about polling and having organizations like the Gallup organization, who has been doing this decade over decade, is that we've asked the same question: do you consider yourself to be a Democrat, Republican, and Independent? And 50 years ago, 1968, 55% of Americans said that they were Democrats, and I think the low 30s to mid 30s said that they were Republicans. Identified that they were with the Republican Party. And then there was what seems to be the same thing of this, 10% of people who said, I'm an independent.
So what's it now? What was in the last poll? We did a poll in January 2018. What do those numbers look like? Because we don't just ask Democrat, Republican, Independent. There are these shades of gray.
Well, the first thing, though, is people who now say that they are independent has grown from that, 10% back 50 years ago to now 4 in 10. And now in some polls, almost 5 in 10 Americans saying, I consider myself independent. I do not consider myself to be attached to one of these parties, Democrat or Republican.
But we look at leaners. We ask them if they say they're an independent. Then we say, well, if you were going to,
right, and that part of the question has been added over time.
And so now we have independents still at this, core group, but there's a huge amount of flux. The strong Democrats are fewer. The strong Republicans are fewer. The independents that are just pure independents are roughly the same. It's all this stuff in the middle.
Yes.
It's all that has changed.
Even people who say that they identify with a party, we then follow up with a question and asking them, well, do you strongly identify with that party or do you somewhat? And believe it or not, even if you say you're a Democrat or Republican, only about 6 in 10 who identify with a particular party say they strongly identify with that party.
All right, so now you're going to both annoy me because I'm going to say something that
we're going to annoy, or you're going to annoy us.
Yeah, no, I'm going to. Did I say you're going to annoy me?
Yeah, I know we annoy you all the time.
Okay, but this time I'm probably going to be annoying you, but I didn't want to phrase it that way. Okay, so what does this all mean? When we look at the electorate, it's becoming both less partisan and more partisan at the same time.
How's that possible?
Are you annoyed?
No, I'm
But
curious.
Okay, so
why the word of the moment?
Why is it less partisan? Well, there's some more independents floating around that haven't been out there decades ago, as Barb just indicated. Why is it more partisan? Because when we talk about who are these core base voters, they are really warriors out there, the Democratic core constituency and the Republican core constituency, and they are battling it out right now over elections. I don't know, the last dozen or so presidential elections. I mean, we've really had this increasing polarization, making people extremely partisan and the country very divided and not much switching back and forth between the parties. Hence, it's less partisan and more partisan at the same time.
But we hear all about swing districts all the time. We hear all about how it's those persuadables that they need to reach. I mean, you can write the script of the 2018 election night coverage.
So many fewer of those districts.
Well, and I also
but are there fewer of those
people,
those voters that actually show up to the polls? I guess what I'm curious about here is that when you look at January 2018, the most recent national we did, and there's 20% strong Democrats and 14% strong Republicans. That, to me, indicates exactly what you said, Barbara, which is there's this real peeling off of the last 50 years of strong identification with the party. And there's 11% independents. It's that flux. It's the 27% that kind of are like, I'm kind of a Democrat, and the 25% that go, I'm kind of a Republican. Do they not vote in enough numbers to represent themselves?
Well,
in other words, what Chuck Todd
process.
likes to talk about is the center is the middle of the road is gone. It's been run over because they don't participate.
Well, also, I think what you're talking about is who are the candidates that we end up with deciding between in November. And what happens is we go through this primary process, and that's where the most intense partisans participate, and the less intense partisans do not. And independents in many states
Can't.
because they're not registered in a party. So in a sense, that whole primary structure and all the rules around who can vote and who can't has also created a much more polarized environment and candidates once we get to November.
And then what happens is the parties themselves, because they don't have as much rich blood in them anymore as they used to, they are having more trouble controlling the very process of picking a nominee. So what did we see last time? We saw Donald Trump, not a lifetime Republican by any means, capturing the Republican nomination.
And Bernie Sanders, who isn't
really
even
close
who
as a
isn't even a
socialist.
Democrat,
Right.
Practically capturing the Democratic Party.
So the parties are showing organizationally a weakness, which is reflected by the very constituencies which have been sort of slowing down over time.
And so- yeah, go ahead.
Well, unfortunately, I think that this is just another American institution that a good number of people have really lost faith and trust in. And what we're seeing in terms of this breakdown of party identification is this really breakdown in trust in the political system itself.
And when I was in graduate school way back when, we read a book by David Broder, who was a dean of political journalists at the Washington Post, and the book was called "The Party's Over." And in that, he
Very
talked
prescient.
about this very topic we're talking about. And in fact, he foresaw that the parties were going to run out of gas. It hasn't happened; they're still there. But
Well, in fact, David Brooks
Yes.
just wrote about the end of the two-party system. Again,
right. And then we're also seeing at the same time politicians running away from the parties to some degree. The a big statewide official in California who is a Republican is going to run for California Insurance Commissioner, which is one of the big statewide elected offices there. There's Attorney General, Governor, Lieutenant Governor, Insurance Commissioner. He's running as an independent. He's not even going to run as a Republican because the Republican Party is so dead in California. But it's not just about a party that has produced two presidents in the last 50 years, the California Republican Party. It's not just that the party's dead. It's that, as you're saying, parties are to a large degree losing their influence and their hold on the American public.
So one of the major things that we didn't put to bed after 2016 was, what did Russia do and not do during the presidential campaign? Well, now I guess it's generally agreed, with the exception of the president, that there was interference by Russia, and we've done some polling
by the
on this.
intelligence agencies.
Yes, and have felt the intelligence community hearings in Senate recently have indicated that, in fact, there seems to be very little debate about whether Russia was involved. And then the big question is, what is going on in preparation so that maybe we can avoid the same problems that we had in 2016 with Russian interference. So, surprise, surprise, we've been polling about that. And we found some really, really interesting results.
Well, that's why I jumped in, because you were suggesting the president is alone.
No, he's not alone on that.
In his in his perception that nothing really has gone on, but in fact, a pretty large proportion of Americans do agree with him. In fact, when we asked whether people think that it will be likely that Russia will interfere in the 2018 November elections, a majority, 53% of Americans, don't think so. They do not think it's likely. 41% do. And not surprisingly, there's a huge partisan difference in these numbers. We see that 60...
I can probably guess. I'm thinking
okay,
maybe...
give it a shot, Lee.
Yeah, I think I have the answers in front of me, so all I have to do is read it. But I will say that 60% of Democrats think there will be interference. Only 17% of Republicans say that.
So I am dumbfounded.
You look baffled.
Because
baffled.
in front of the Senate yesterday we're doing this on Valentine's Day for those of you who are listening in and wondering when we tape this. There was a bombshell story. It was a huge story. The leaders of every one of our national security agencies told the Senate, and remember, the leaders of every one of our national security agencies is a Republican. Mm-hmm. Every single one of them said, it is not going to happen in 2018. It is happening right now. Russia is in the process of attempting to interfere with our elections. And Americans don't believe it. What is going on?
Well, I think part of this, and you can see this gets back to our clans, our tribes, however we want to, talk about how people have taken sides on this. But when I'm thinking back to football season, and when the New England Patriots had Deflategate. Well, if you were a Patriot fan, you weren't really sure they were doing anything with the ball, and so
you didn't necessarily care to find information that they might have in fact been doing it.
Yeah, because football
Winning's winning.
is basically the same as keeping our democracy in one piece.
Well, but I think we see a little bit of this in this particular issue as well, because it has been, at least publicly described and debated in more partisan terms. Yes, if you're following the testimony, I think this is a real wake-up call.
It was the lead story on every newscast and in every paper and on every blog, and it was filling Twitter and Facebook yesterday, all day.
So the question is, who are you going to believe? The national security
the
folks?
national security
Hang on.
agent, the heads of the National Security Agency, all of whom, every single one of which is a Republican.
But it's not
and
that
Republicans don't think it's happening.
It's not
and
that,
36% of Democrats don't
but
think it's likely.
Not that
It's
people,
happening.
It's not that people do not believe our security leaders. They do not. It's not that they don't believe our intelligence agencies. We also asked people about what they thought of the FBI, and the FBI has actually a very favorable rating among Americans as a whole. In fact, 65% of Americans, and even a majority, 55% of Republicans, have a positive view of the FBI.
So when Chris Wray, the director of the FBI, sits in front of this Senate panel and says the Russians are currently underway trying to influence our elections in 2018, how come 55% of Republicans and 82% of Dems who think that the FBI is a good thing don't believe that the Russians are interfering when the head of the FBI, the agency they like, is saying it's happening today, right now?
I think because if it was so critical, perhaps people would think that there would be more being done about it. And we did ask people about whether they think that the social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, Google, are doing enough or doing something to make sure that there is no Russian interference coming in the midterms this year. And 73% of Americans said that they've done very little, or nothing at all, to ensure that there is no foul play.
Yeah, but I want to go ahead.
But also a similar proportion.
We're very
It's actually
argumentative on this topic.
The same proportion, 73% of Americans also think that Congress has done very little. Mm-hmm. So they don't see the intensity of concern in the areas where they think if something had happened and is about to happen, that anybody's doing something about it.
A couple things. To your question on the FBI, I was astounded by the fact that 55% of Republicans believe in the FBI at this point.
You thought that was high.
No, I think it's incredibly low, given, dial back a decade or two, and those numbers would have been amazingly greater.
Well,
we've had an attack on our institutions.
Yeah, in this debate, though.
And in this debate, clearly, the partisanship, the Republicans are having an identity crisis of some sort when it comes to who are you going to believe in all this. And if the FBI seems to be against Donald Trump, that's going to run them down in the perceptions of
Democrats in the uncomfortable position of having to side with the FBI and the CIA.
Yes, I've heard some former hippies and yippies and whatever from the 60s finding themselves very uncomfortable that they're now looking forward to the FBI and the CIA to sort of bring truth and sanity to the process.
And I think there's some confusion as well. We asked about whether they felt that in the dealings with Russia and their investigations, is the FBI doing their job, or do they think that they're biased against the Trump administration? And again, obviously there's a partisan divide here. But interestingly, 71% of Americans do think that the FBI is doing its job, including 43% of Republicans. Now, 49% of Republicans think that it's biased, but I think with all the give and take and all the debate that we have seen over the issue in the last few weeks, I saw that as very interesting and actually, a positive in terms of people's perception of our intelligence community.
And so where are we going with this? To the question of whether Donald Trump has done anything wrong, illegal, unethical. I mean, some interesting numbers in the poll. The people who think he's done something illegal is 29%, but that's up from 19% this time last year. People who think he's done something unethical, not necessarily illegal, is at 28%. If you add the 28 and the 29, he's done something wrong 57%. So it's not exactly a big send-off on his numbers, up from 49% this time last year. So to get to your question of why are people very slowly getting connected to this, you see the direction is going that way. People are getting more focused. It's just really slow. Maybe there's been no smoking guns, or maybe there is one every day and it just doesn't have that impact.
Do, 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 do. Is that a fair approximation of, remember that? Close Encounters?
Do you know that was 35? Oh, no, you're right. That's Close Encounters.
That was Close
I was
Encounters.
thinking of E.T.
You're doing E.T. Well, they're about the same time, right? They're about the same time.
About 30. Well, at least 3 decades.
So we've been asking whether the reason we're doing that is not to show off our dulcet tones of imitating movie soundtracks, but rather we've been asking people if they believe that aliens exist for a long time.
Do.
And most people do.
They do.
But there's been a change that strikes me as kind of interesting, and I'm wondering why.
Back in 2005, just a slim majority, 52% of Americans agreed that there was probably intelligent life on other planets. But now we find almost 7 in 10, 68% of Americans tell us that they think intelligent life does exist out there. And one of the things that I found that was really very interesting was that a majority of people who think there's intelligent life beyond Earth actually think they're more likely to find us before we find them.
That's not very comforting. We did not ask, however, whether they think whether aliens of outer space think Russia has interfered with the presidential elections or not.
Thank goodness.
Because that would be something
why,
mixed metaphor of
So
sorts.
why do you think that in 2005 it was about half and now it's almost 7 in 10? What's happened between 2005 and 2018 that would get us believing in UFOs?
It's a very
Any
good
ideas?
question.
I think that there is a lot of excitement. I think there's a lot of interest, particularly among younger people and people or adults under 45 years of age about going beyond. The new frontier for these Americans is outer space. It's Mars. It's looking to go beyond our earthly borders. In addition, we've seen, we've been able to track sounds.
Yep. Technology. We've got some good technology going right now.
And there's been a lot of, again, private excitement, as particularly with the launch with Elon Musk's focus on Mars and focus on going beyond and into space, again, from the private sector. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that people are now looking beyond.
Yeah, but here's the thing I find interesting. Is it life in other planets more or less intelligent than here on Earth? 46% say it's more intelligent. 13% say it's less intelligent. Now, is that an endorsement of outer space or a condemnation of Earth?
Someone actually tweeted back at us. Did we ask whether people think there's intelligent life on Earth?
On Earth? That would have been my question, yeah.
Or whether it's already happened. The invasion has already happened. There were some people who felt that also.
Well, the weekly world news on the newsstand, I think a few years ago had Obama was actually an alien. So, it is possible, right?
No, I think when you're standing in the checkout lines at the grocery. Don't necessarily believe all those
You
headlines.
stand in a checkout line?
Well, yeah. Well, I'm old-fashioned. Not the technology has affected me. I do stand in checkout lines.
Well, that'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Big thanks to our executive producer, Mary Griffith, who always keeps us on track. And we'd also like to thank the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University, who provides us with the ability to look back in time at survey questions and results over the decades.
And we do a lot of polling here. We don't always just poll on political questions, as I think you could tell from that last segment about the aliens. And we would love to ask some questions that you have on your mind, whether they be about aliens or life here on Earth or something in between, if there is such a thing. So send us your questions to pollhub@marist.edu. Those aren't just questions about the podcast, but questions that we can actually ask in our polls. You can have an influence on that. You might get your question asked to thousands of people, and we can report that out, and that would be pretty cool, right?
Absolutely. And where do you find us? Where do you find us? You can check us out on social media, the Marist Poll on Twitter, Marist Poll on Facebook, Snapchat, and Instagram. We're all over the place. And you can also subscribe. That's not a bad thing either. Then you'll find out what we're doing when we're doing it.